Did Russians and perhaps the United States, its allies, overestimated the military might and capacities of the Russian military? Could we foresee that the Russian invasion of Ukraine will fail so dramatically? Is military defeat of Russia and the end of the war possible? These are the questions that are interesting for everyone who is horrified with slaughter in Bucha and elsewhere in Ukraine, where Russian forces invaded. To answer these questions, I have invited Scott Boston, a senior defense analyst at the RAND Corporation. His research focuses on land warfare with particular emphasis on Russian military. Thank you, Mr. Boston, for your time. In a little less than 3 weeks after Russians invaded Ukraine, it became apparent that Russians were not winning. They were just destroying, but they are not capable of capturing any major city in Ukraine except for Kherson. They failed in Kiev, they failed in Kharkiv, and they still can't take over Mariupol, the city that they completely destroyed. We used to say that Putin miscalculated his chances, his military capacities before he took the decision to invade Ukraine, but the intelligence services in the United States and his Western allies apparently also miscalculated Putin's chances by overestimating the military might of the Kremlin. Is this the case? And was there any correction or adjustment to this narrative, to this thinking by the West?
So yeah, first off, yes, there probably was some overestimation of Russian capability. The harsh light of reality has shown that in a number of things, the difference between how Russians trained and what they were able to execute is in some cases pretty substantial. But it also should be placed in the context that Russia's plan for this operation was extremely unsound. And it was based on some, what we suspect was probably a major intelligence failure, where Russia may have believed that Ukrainian forces were not going to fight back, or that they had successfully managed to co-opt enough Ukrainians in order to make the operation feasible, despite the lack of preparation for large-scale offensive operations. And that's actually what we saw. They were not prepared to transition quickly to large-scale employment of violence to achieve their operational objectives. They were stuck pretty quickly and had to change their plan in mid-stride, which they have not done very well.
What is the problem with the Russian military? Why did they fail on a battlefield? While they were brutal in their missile attacks on civilians and military targets, they were mostly helpless and in land operations. As a former field officer of the United States and renowned expert in this field, how do you read the military mind of Russian field commanders, Russian army generals? Why are they so ineffective and so helpless against very mobile and capable Ukrainian forces?
So the first and probably the most important challenge that they have created for themselves is utterly insufficient planning and preparation for the combat operation. That has multiple aspects to it. One of the most important aspects is because they seem to have believed that they wouldn't be encountering very much resistance, right? And everyone was surprised for different reasons. The United States, and I should say the West, Western intelligence community in particular, watched the buildup with growing concern because they correctly, it turned out, believed that Russia was potentially going to invade Ukraine, but they were surprised that Russia didn't prepare to do so effectively. Ukraine saw the Russian preparation and did not actually believe Russia was going to invade because what they saw didn't look to them like an attack was forming until within days of the invasion when they started to increase their preparation. So they were surprised that Russia would actually attack without having done the preparation. And of course, the biggest surprise of all was that Russia, after spending 5 months building forces all around Ukraine, sending forces thousands of kilometers from the Eastern Military District to Belarus, did not effectively plan for an operation that would actually encounter anything like the level of resistance that it encountered. So they spectacularly underrated, I think, Ukrainian ability to resist. And I think just straight up misunderstood the kind of war that they were about to enter into. They thought that what their real risk was that people would find out what they were doing. And so they kept a lot of plans, we think, secret even from their own soldiers, and then tried to carry this out like it was a sequel to the 2014 Crimea invasion, where Ukrainian forces were disrupted and did not effectively resist. In this case, lightning did not strike twice, and they had a catastrophic failure that they spent, I think, weeks recovering from.
And how about the Russian army generals and philosophy of conducting the war by Russians? Not only is equipment outdated to some extent, but also philosophy, right? As a military expert, what do you say about that? I mean, they have this strategy of encircling and pounding cities with the missiles and shelling everything, destroying, and then going in. In this case, they failed dramatically.
Yeah, and it's actually really striking that they did, because for those of us who watched how Russia carried out operations in Syria, right, for the last several years, and who looked at how they train and the things that they emphasize in training, a great many of those things weren't here. We know Russia has a much larger air force than they have put forward, and they have been spectacularly ineffective at employing air beyond the front lines, at least. So the kinds of deep strikes that we would have expected, they were not able to carry out and don't seem to have tried, actually. They have used a good number of their long-range strike systems, but they have used them like cruise missiles and ballistic missiles in a very diluted way, right? And it's not been totally clear why they did not use those more effectively. I would argue they actually have the doctrine to use it differently, but they did not choose to do so. Early in the conflict, that could have been because they thought that they were going to get to keep Ukraine and they didn't want to cause too much damage to it. Later on, they have been, I think, a little less clear about what they're trying to do. There was a lot of floundering around in the north and ultimately a withdrawal. Now they seem to be doubling down in the Donbass and the greater Donetsk and Luhansk regions. And I expect that we'll probably see some offensive operations that are conducted.
Boston, I was going to ask you just about that. Russians don't want to admit that they could not achieve their military goals of capturing Kiev, bringing the whole country into its knees, forcing the government to surrender. They say now that it was never their goal. They even deny the report that they wanted to topple Zelensky's government and even to assassinate him. They now say that they achieved the military objectives in phase 1, which is to reduce the Ukrainian military capabilities. That would prevent them from further attacks against separatist region of Luhansk and Donetsk. They say that they shifted their focus on eastern regions of Ukraine to defend the Russian-speaking population. Do you foresee major military offensive in the eastern Ukraine? Are Russians regrouping, actually, not withdrawing, for the new major attack in the east?
Yes, so they're definitely repositioning forces, including units that they've pulled out from the north. I'll also contest. There's a lot of evidence that obviously that Kyiv and Chernihiv and parts north in Ukraine were important objectives for the Russians based on the number and quality of the troops that were deployed there, and that in fact took very heavy casualties. I can't imagine it could even really be conceived as a successful diversion from that perspective. What we're seeing now is probably greater mass and greater concentration than we saw in the initial attack. So the initial invasion was very diluted. I think that what we're probably going to see is a more concentrated attack in fewer areas with more forces. in order to overcome Ukrainian defenses. I would expect them to more effectively employ a combined arms force, so a mix of artillery and tanks and infantry with air support. Although so far they haven't really demonstrated a lot of adeptness in integrating those arms. They have trained to do it in the past. At this scale, though, it's difficult to see how well and how quickly they'll be able to overcome the limitations that they've shown so far in command and control and planning.
Is there any possibility that there were some sabotaging the military operation, as they say? Putin fired a lot of high-ranking military officials and put them in house arrest, and even high-ranking security officials were also fired and arrested. What is going on there? Do you have any ideas? What are your thoughts?
I can really only speculate there.
Yes.
But in a little over 6 weeks now, and really it only took about a week, this operation was a profound humiliation for the Russian military. And it is largely attributable, I think, to the intelligence failure that I mentioned earlier. I would have expected them to do things differently and to have had a sounder plan and much more preparation for the actual war that they're in. That didn't happen. It does not mean that it could not have happened. So somewhere, at some point, someone went forward with an extremely unsound plan. And if there's any accountability in that system, and it is not completely clear that there is, but if there's accountability in that system, then someone is probably in some trouble over it.
Now let's talk about the other part of Ukrainian forces. First of all, your evaluation, why they were so successful. Let's talk about their success first, or maybe you think that it was not as successful at all. What's your take on that?
It's really, I mean, even a successful defense of the Kyiv area, as we've seen, has been a nightmarish experience for the people who live there. And it's really, I'm trying to think of the words, right? It's actually really difficult for me to view any of this as anything other than a gigantic tragedy. And it's,
There is some sort of mobility in Ukrainian forces. It seems to me that they were trained by the Western military experts. As I know, the U.S. military is helping them a lot, and NATO military is also helping with their expertise, and it was very active. NATO was very active in reforming the Ukrainian army. Is this partially a result of that, or there is something more? They're protecting their homeland, for example. They're fighting for their homes, families, and for their country. They have high motivation.
Yeah, I don't know that I want to say too much about what the United States and NATO are doing, because I think that although, I mean, it's very clear that there's good reason, because it's an immensely popular thing right now to do things to support Ukraine. I think in my view, we need to be somewhat circumspect about what we talk about, although the volume of support and the kinds of things that we are doing, I think, have had an important effect. I don't want, however, to take away from the fact that it's Ukrainians who are fighting and dying. It is Ukraine's leadership who have managed to very effectively, I think, take charge of the narrative, and who have been very effectively communicating Ukraine's position. And actually, the way that they have been fighting this actually has been quite smart. We knew about some limitations in Ukrainian combat formations, and this is something that they had worked on, and they have actually used, I think, very effective tactics that are very difficult for Russia to counter. And one of the important aspects of this is the simple fact that Ukraine's country has been invaded. Ukrainians are reacting appropriately to the fact that their country has been invaded. Their countrymen and women are being murdered, and Russian forces are not able to operate in the same ways. So Ukrainian forces are motivated. They are operating in a decentralized way, which means that small units are going out and conducting effective engagements. It is, in some cases, it's a death by a thousand cuts type of strategy. But there are a great many Ukrainians that are, I think, eager to go out and carry the fight to the Russians. And what we would infer, but also what we're hearing from various sources, is that by comparison, Russian forces are not highly motivated, even to the extent that that Russians at home may have a flawed understanding of what's going on in Ukraine. The reality is right there to Russian soldiers, and that reality is they were set up to fail initially. They've suffered extremely high casualties. It's not like there is air support for them. It's not like they were getting sufficient logistics. They weren't getting fuel and ammo, right? So like the kinds of problems that they have, and they're facing an entire country that appears to be united in resistance. So I'm not surprised if their morale is not good. What they're doing is terrible, and they shouldn't feel good about it.
And what if the sanctions don't work? There is an opinion that sanctions would not force Putin to stop the war, and that ordinary Russians will believe the Kremlin propaganda narrative that the West is trying to destroy Russia, that actually will rally people around Putin, as it is the case so far. There are the suggestions by the expert that the West, along with tightening economic and other non-military sanctions, should also dramatically enhance the quality of the military aid to Ukraine by providing more lethal systems of conducting the war, such as anti-aircraft defense system. For example, some NATO members have Russian-made S-300 anti-aircraft defense system, which could be easily used by the Ukrainian army because they are familiar with this equipment. What's your take on that? Is the United States doing enough to support Ukraine militarily? What's your take? Should the United States and the West provide more than they're doing now? Aren't they too afraid of giving to Ukrainians more sophisticated weaponry?
So the answer to that, I can't answer, because there's part of that is the political decision about risk of escalation, and also an understanding on the ground of what weapon systems are the most effective. I will say, in response to the comment that you made earlier about sanctions effectiveness, and I'm not an economist, I believe what we are seeing over time is that we may well see, it may actually have some longer term effects on Russia's ability, but in the short run, I unfortunately, I think I have to agree with you, or agree with the people that you had mentioned, that it's not at all clear that sanctions will bring this to an end quickly. And I don't think it leads necessarily to a Russian military defeat. The fact is, the Russians have a lot of military capacity, and they're choosing what to send and what to commit to Ukraine. And if they want it to stop, all they have to do is go home. They're not stopping. They are doubling down. We could probably guess, it's at least plausible, that Putin is going to be in this until he finds something that he can plausibly claim is a win to his people, even though it does seem to be a lot less than he thought he was going to get initially. But as far as support, I mean, it does seem that, particularly given how Russia employed its forces, some of the support that has been provided has had an opportunity to help a great deal more than I think we would have expected. And to the extent that that is, to the extent that that is attriting and blunting the ability of Russian forces to seize more terrain and with all the additional the negative impacts of that, that's a good thing.
Do you think that the military defeat of Russia is a possibility which could make them stop the war, or disastrous turn of events on the battlefield could make them stop the war? Is that an option here?
I would like to think that there would be some way to do it, but I'm not totally sure what it would be. I mean, the truth is, I mean, Ukraine is, so far has been very effective in resisting and has denied a good deal of its territory to Russia. Russia still has taken a good deal of southern Ukraine, for example. And in order to push Russia back to, let's just say, back to the February 23rd border, right? So back to Crimea, back to the formerly, the line of control in the Donbass, would require substantial offensive operations by the Ukrainians. And they have done, they've had some counterattacks so far. They would need, I think, considerable support in order to be able to create and carry out large-scale offensive operations against resistance. To be frank, it's not clear that either side has had a lot of success with sort of the large-scale multi-brigade or division, like attack, actually, causing the destruction and seizing the terrain from the adversary. Ukraine, because it probably didn't have enough capability and capacity, at least early in the fight. Russia, because they screwed it up.
And what kind of weaponry Ukraine is getting now that it didn't have before? What kind of new systems in general are they getting now? So,
I mean, some of these things are things that we've seen before, right? So, and we can talk, of course, about like the sorts of things that the United States has declared that it is sending. So, anti-tank guided missiles and shoulder-fired anti-aircraft missiles. With this newer package, the delivery of some number of loitering munitions, a system I believe that they've acknowledged is called Switchblade, which is a fairly effective, small, man-portable drone that is also a munition. The Turkish,
these are like kamikaze type
yeah.
Drones, right? They go and they just hit the target and destroy, and then
right.
Okay, go ahead.
And in fact, so a system like Switchblade can actually fly around the battlefield for at least a number of minutes, and it can tell you what's over the next hill. It can allow you to select a target that is appropriate for it. The smaller loitering munitions of that variety are probably going to be fine against personnel or against soft targets, and in particular Russian artillery vehicles and ammunition. They don't use insensitive munitions, so if you hit them with even a small explosive, they're likely to all explode. So those are really good targets. And to the extent that we send them more advanced loitering munitions, I believe there is at least a rumor that the larger variant of Switchblade that has a javelin-type warhead on it, that would be very effective against a number of more armored or better protected targets. And that would be, I mean, we really might be actually seeing just the beginning of a new stage in land warfare with the kind of volume of UAVs over time. Right now, it's just a pittance compared to what I think we would expect in the future. But I would also expect that the Ukrainians can probably put them to good use.
And last question about the Armenian military. It has actually adopted the Russian military philosophy, Russian military doctrine, military textbooks. and it was trained by the Russian military. Now the Russians are helping Armenians to reform the Armenian army. How effective could be reforming the Armenian army by the Russian army that is failing on the battlefield so badly?
I mean, to the extent that, in fairness, Russia hasn't effectively employed its own doctrine. Russian forces have not been committed in ways that are consistent with how they've been trained. And Russian, I think most importantly, Russian, soldiers, weren't prepared for this, right? And so, we kind of get back to the beginning of the conversation, which is Russia planned for a different kind of war than it got. And so it's at least plausible that in other conflicts they would have and have, in fact, in the recent past, performed more effectively, at least in smaller at smaller scales. So I don't know that I'd write it off completely, but at the very least, from the perspective of any other military, watching very closely the limitations that show themselves, especially if it's a military that's similar to yours. Try not to make those mistakes. That would be a reasonable approach, I would guess.
Yeah.
To an extent, the war in Ukraine is a Rorschach test, right? Everyone sees something different in it. And part of that is because there's a great deal that we don't see at all. But you'll also see, people from Western militaries will talk about the importance of a non-commissioned officer corps, right? Because Russia doesn't have one. Well, Ukrainian military does not have a long tradition of a, professional non-commissioned officer corps either. It used to be part of the Soviet military. So that's not part of the explanation necessarily. There's, a lot of different things. And so what is the military that you are designing supposed to do? And then is it employed, in accordance with, how it was trained? And was it prepared adequately? Is there a good plan for its use? All of those things kind of need to work together to actually get success in a military operation, if that makes sense.
And thank you very much, Mr. Boston. I hope we can talk about this subject also in the future. Thank you.